Welcome to the mystery of life.
Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender who murdered and chopped up body parts of men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Also known by the name Milwaukee Monster or Milwaukee Cannibal, Dahmer had sex with the bodies of his dead victims. He also ate them and preserved them. At trial, Dahmer was found to be legally sane despite having schizotypal personality disorder, psychotic disorder, and borderline personality disorder. He was sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. He was found beaten to death by his fellow inmate. Dahmer was born to Joyce and Lionel Dahmer on May 21, 1960. He was the first of two sons. Sources varied on whether Dahmer was deprived of love and attention as an infant, although it was well known that his mother Joyce was constantly in need of attention and often argued with her husband and neighbors. Joyce was a hypochondriac, constantly worrying about her own health. She was always in fear that she had some kind of serious illness. Joyce also suffered from depression. She was increasingly spending more and more time in bed. Her symptoms continued to worsen when she became pregnant with her second child. She had even attempted suicide. Jeffrey's father, Lionel, was not home much of the time. He was busy with his studies at the university. This was all happening as Dahmer entered first grade. Dahmer was described as an energetic and happy child but began to change after having hernia surgery to repair his weakened abdominal wall when he was just 4 years old. Dahmer became quiet and timid. His elementary school teacher noticed signs of abandonment. Despite this, Dahmer did have a small number of friends. In December 1966, Jeffrey Dahmer chose David as the name of his new baby brother. Dahmer's family had moved to Doylestown, Ohio, where Jeffrey's father Lionel was now working as a chemist in nearby town of Akron. Ever since Dahmer was a child, he was fascinated with dead animals. When he was 4 years old, he watched his father remove animal bones from underneath their house. His father recalled that Jeffrey was oddly thrilled by the experience, and that his son enjoyed the sound of bones. The young Dahmer would continue to search for more bones underneath his home from time to time. In 1966, the family moved once again, this time to Summit County, Ohio. His new home was on 1.5 acres of woodland, and it came with a small hut. This is where Dahmer would begin his collection of insects and skeletons of small animals. He learned to preserve some of these animals in jars of formaldehyde. One time at dinner, Dahmer asked his father what would happen if he put chicken bones in bleach. Being a chemist, Lionel takes the question as his son's curious and budding scientific mind. Lionel showed Jeffrey how to safely bleach and preserve animal bones. This new learned skill greatly increased Dahmer's collection of dead animals in his hut. Dahmer's mind worked differently. He was intensely curious on how all the animal body parts fit together. But Dahmer's lack of empathy for life became apparent when he invited a friend to show off his display of a decapitated dog. The dog's head was impaled on a stick, the body nailed to a tree. Dahmer claimed he found it by chance. Dahmer continued to play with dead animals as his own mother's condition continued to worsen. Joyce was beginning to slip away from her family as she increases her consumption of drugs, laxatives, and sleeping pills. Dahmer generally kept to himself in high school. He played tennis and was in a band for a short time. He would become known as a prankster, a joker of sort. Dahmer learned that he was gay when he reached puberty, but kept it to himself and did not tell his parents. He began drinking during the day at age 14, referring to scotch as his medicine. In his early teens, Dahmer began having sexual fantasies about male partners. One particular jogger he found attractive, Dahmer had waited in the bushes, planning on making him part of his first experiment. He fantasized about rendering his victim unconscious, so he could have complete control over their body. His masturbation fantasies grew into detailed imaginations on how to dissect the chest and torso. Luckily for the jogger, he did not pass by on that particular day. His grades, like his parents' marriage, got worse over time. Tutoring and counseling did not help. His parents fought often. They finally filed for a divorce when his father found out that his mother had a brief affair. His father moved out. In May 1978, Dahmer graduated from high school. His mother and his brother David moved to Wisconsin to live with relatives. Dahmer, having just turned 18, now lives alone at home. That same year, Dahmer committed his first murder. On June 18, Dahmer picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Dahmer lured him to his house for a drink. Hicks went along, agreeing to have a few beers. After hours of talking, drinking and listening to music, Hicks wanted to leave. While Hicks was sitting in his chair, Dahmer struck him from behind with a 10-pound dumbbell. Dahmer then strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell. He stripped the clothes from Hicks' body before caressing his chest with his hands. Dahmer masturbated as he stood above his victim's body. Hours later, he dragged the corpse to the basement. He dissected the body the following day. He later buried the remains in a shallow grave in his backyard. Weeks later, he dug up the remains and separated the flesh from the bones. He dissolved the flesh in acid and flushed it down the toilet. He crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woodland behind the family home. Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University several weeks after his first murder. His father would occasionally visit, only to find scattered empty liquor bottles. Dahmer dropped out of college after 3 months. At his father's urging, Dahmer began basic training at Fort McClellan in Anniston, Alabama in 1979. He had also trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. Wherever he went during Army training, Dahmer brought his alcohol problems along with him. In March 1981, he was deemed unsuitable for military service and was later discharged from the Army. After the Army, Dahmer moved to Miami Beach, Florida. He wanted to live on his own, in a warmer place, and could not return home to face his father. Jeffrey found work at a local deli and spent most of his money on alcohol. After being evicted from his motel for not paying, he called his father and said he wanted to come home. Back at home in Ohio, he continued to drink heavily, after having promised his father and his stepmother that he would clean up his act and be more responsible. 2 weeks later, Dahmer was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. In December 1981, he was sent to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. Dahmer loved his grandmother. His father hoped that she could help Dahmer quit his drinking and turn his life around. Life with his grandmother went well at first. He continued to drink and smoke, but obeyed all of her house rules, went with her to church, and helped with chores. During this time, he was fined and arrested for indecent exposure. He worked as a phlebotomist for 10 months before being laid off. Dahmer eventually found another job at a Milwaukee chocolate factory. One night, he was asked by another man if he would accept a sexual favor. This event stirred up all his wild childhood fantasies once again. Dahmer began going to local gay bars and bathhouses. He kept a male mannequin hidden in his closet for his sexual gratification. His grandmother later found it and made him throw it away. After many sexual encounters, Dahmer learned that he didn't like it when his partners moved around too much. Because he preferred his partners to remain still during sex, he began to lace their drinks with sedatives. He would wait for his partner to fall asleep before acting out his sexual fantasies. He once read about an upcoming funeral of an 18-year-old man and made plans to steal his corpse. He abandoned the plan when he couldn't dig through the hard soil to get to the coffin. In 1986, Dahmer was arrested for masturbating in front of two 12-year-old boys by the river. Dahmer met Stephen Twomey, a 25-year-old man from Ontonagon, Michigan in 1987. Dahmer had rented a room at the Ambassador Hotel and invited Steven to come over. He had only intended to drug him and lie beside him as he explored his body. He had no intention to kill him. The next morning, Twomey was dead. He was found with bruises, chest crushed in, bleeding from his mouth. Dahmer claimed he had no memory of what had happened, but his own fists and forearm were very bruised. Dahmer got rid of Twomey's body by stuffing it in a large suitcase and brought it to his grandmother's house. A week later, he severed the head, arms and legs, then stripped the bones from the body before cutting the flesh into small pieces. It took him 2 hours to complete the dismemberment. He threw away the body-filled plastic bag in the trash, except for the head. Dahmer kept Twomey's head wrapped in a blanket. He boiled the head in a mixture of Soilex and bleach to preserve its condition, which he then used as stimulus for masturbation. Eventually, Dahmer got rid of the skull as well, as it became too brittle by the bleaching process. Following the murder of Twomey, Dahmer began to actively seek victims. He would find them in or close to gay bars, and lured them to his grandmother's home. He would drug his victim before or shortly after sex. After they become unconscious, he killed them by strangulation. James Dockstader would be Dahmer's next victim, 2 months after he killed Twomey. Dockstader was a 14-year-old Native American male prostitute. Dahmer offered him $50 to pose for nude pictures. They had sex before Dahmer drugged and strangled him to death. Dahmer left the body in the cellar for 1 week before dismembering it the same way he did with Twomey. He placed all of Dockstader's remains in the trash. The skull was boiled and once again, becoming too brittle by the bleaching process, was crushed into powder and thrown away. In March 1988, Dahmer met a 22-year-old bisexual man named Richard Guerrero outside a gay bar called the Phoenix. This time the offer of $50 was to simply spend the remainder of the night with him. He drugged Guerrero with sleeping pills and strangled him with a leather strap. Dahmer then performed oral sex on the corpse. Dahmer dismembered Guerrero's body within 24 hours and got rid of the remains in the trash. He kept the skull before pulverizing it several months later. The next young man's fate was different. He was saved by Dahmer's grandmother. On April 23, Dahmer lured a young man to his house. After giving the victim a drugged coffee, they both heard Dahmer's grandmother call, "Is that you, Jeff?" Dahmer tried to play it off like he was alone, but she found that he was not alone. Because of this, Dahmer decided not to kill this young man. Dahmer's grandmother eventually asked him to move out in September 1988. She was tired of his drinking, his habit of bringing young men to her house late at night, and the foul smells from the basement and the garage. Dahmer found a one-bedroom apartment and moved into his new residence later that same month. 2 days later, he lured a 13-year-old boy into his apartment. He was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling the young boy. Dahmer's father hired an attorney to defend his son. His lawyer requested that he go through a series of psychological tests before his upcoming court hearings. The results showed that Dahmer held deep feelings of alienation. A follow-up evaluation showed that Dahmer was an impulsive individual, suspicious of others, and dismayed by his lack of accomplishments in life. He had previously been diagnosed with a schizoid personality disorder. Dahmer pleaded guilty to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and of enticing a child for immoral purposes. He moved back into his grandmother's home. 2 months after his conviction, Dahmer murdered his 5th victim. Anthony Sears was a 24-year-old aspiring model. Dahmer met him at a gay bar in March 1989. According to Dahmer, Sears just started talking to him. He had not intended to commit any crime on this night. Sears' fate ended similar to Dahmer's other victims. Dahmer brought Sears to his grandmother's home. They engaged in oral sex before Dahmer drugged and strangled him. Dahmer had no shortage of pills as he convinced his doctors he had chronic sleeping problems because of his job. The following morning, Dahmer placed the corpse in his grandmother's bathtub, where he decapitated the body. He stripped the flesh from the body and crushed the bones and disposed them in the trash. Dahmer found Sears exceptionally attractive. He preserved Sears' head and genitalia and kept them in a wooden box. On May 23, 1989, for the assault on the young boy, Dahmer was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction. He was able to keep his job with a work release but was required to register as a sex offender. On May 14, 1990, Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's house and into apartment 213, taking Sears' mummified head and genitals with him. Within 1 week of his moving into his new apartment, Dahmer claimed his 6th victim, Raymond Smith. Dahmer gave the 32-year-old male prostitute a drink laced with sleeping pills, then manually strangled him. Dahmer took pictures of Smith's dead body in sexual positions with a Polaroid camera the next day. He then dismembered him in the bathroom. He boiled the limbs and rinsed the bones in the sink. He spray-painted the skull and kept it next to Sears' skull in a metal cabinet. 1 week later, Dahmer lured another young man to his apartment. Only this time, he himself drank the laced drink by mistake. When he woke up the next day, his intended victim had stolen some of his clothing, his watch, and $300. In June 1990, Dahmer lured a 27-year-old Edward Smith to his apartment. Like his other victims, Dahmer drugged and strangled Smith. This time, learning that the skull becomes too brittle when repeatedly washed with bleach, he placed Smith's skeleton in his freezer for several months instead, hoping the freezer would remove the moisture in the skull. As it turned out, this did not work as Dahmer intended, so he put Smith's skull in acid, then later in the oven to dry. To his surprise, the skull exploded in the oven. Dahmer would later admit to the police that he felt rotten for not being able to save any of Smith's body parts. To Dahmer, it was his way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. If he couldn't keep them there with him whole, at least he could keep their skeletons. Dahmer would continue his killings to a total of 17 victims. At times, he would be contacted by the building manager on complaints from other residents about foul-smelling odors coming from his apartment. Dahmer would always have a reason for the smells, such as his freezer breaking down, causing the contents to spoil, or his dead fish. These explanations were enough for him to continue his rampage. A close call for Dahmer came when he met a 14-year-old teenager named Connor Axintasumphone, who went by the alias John Mung. Dahmer did not realize that John was the younger brother of the boy whom he had molested in 1988. He offered the teenager money to pose for Polaroid pictures in his apartment. Dahmer drugged him and performed oral sex on him, while the body of Tony Hughes, whom Dahmer had killed 3 days earlier, lay naked on the floor. Dahmer drilled a hole into John's skull and injected hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe. Dahmer then drank several beers before falling asleep. He then left his apartment to drink at a bar and purchased more alcohol. Dahmer returned toward his apartment and found John sitting naked on the corner with 3 young women standing near him. Dahmer told the worried women that John was his friend. Dahmer tried to take John back to his apartment, but the women wouldn't let him, and said that they had called 911. 2 Milwaukee police officers showed up. Dahmer told the officers that John was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had a misunderstanding and he had drunk too much. He told them John would often behave this way when he had too much Jack Daniels. One of the women tried to convince the police that the boy had injuries to his testicles and rectum, and that John didn't want to go with Dahmer when he tried to take him back to his apartment. The officer, seeing no injuries other than a minor scrape on John, scolded the woman and told her to butt out and shut the hell up. Shortly after, 3 members of the Milwaukee Fire Department arrived at the scene. They also examined John and gave him a yellow blanket to cover himself in. One of them thought John needed treatment, but the police officers told the fire department to leave. Thereafter, Officer Richard Perubkin arrived at the scene. He and 2 other officers escorted Dahmer and John to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer would repeatedly comment on the general crime in the neighborhood and shared his appreciation of the police. Inside his apartment, Dahmer showed the officers the 2 semi-nude Polaroid pictures of John in an attempt to prove that they were in fact lovers. One of the officers noted a scent of fecal matter inside the apartment. This odor was coming from the decomposing body of Hughes. One officer simply peeked his head around the bedroom but really didn't take a good look. The officers listed the incident as a domestic dispute. Before leaving, they told Dahmer to take good care of John. As soon as the officers left, Dahmer again injected hydrochloric acid into John's brain. This second injection proved fatal. The following day, May 28th, Dahmer took a day off from work to dismember both John and Hughes' bodies. He kept both of their skulls. On July 2, 1991, Dahmer approached 3 men with an offer of $100 to come to his apartment to have drinks and pose for nude photographs. One of them agreed. 32-year-old Tracy Edwards noted a foul odor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor. He saw nude male posters on the wall and realized that The Exorcist movie was playing in the background. He also noticed a strong odor coming from a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner. Dahmer took out a knife and told Edwards he intended to take nude pictures of him. Trying to appease Dahmer, Edwards unbuttoned his shirt, saying he would allow him to do so if he would remove the handcuffs and put the knife away. Edwards watched as Dahmer turned towards the TV, rocking back and forth and chanting before turning his attention back to him. Dahmer placed his head on Edwards' chest, listened to his heartbeat, and with the knife pressed against his chest, told Edwards he was going to eat his heart. Edwards planned to jump from a window or run through the unlocked front door at the next opportunity. He played along to appease Dahmer, being careful with every move. He convinced Dahmer to sit with him in the living room where there was air conditioning. He told Dahmer he needed to use the bathroom, and when he noticed Dahmer wasn't paying attention as he got up, he struck Dahmer in the face and ran out the front door. Edwards flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers at the corner of North 25th Street. The officers noted Edwards had a handcuff attached to his wrist. He explained that a freak placed the handcuffs on him and asked the police to remove them. Edwards brought the officers to the apartment where he spent the previous 5 hours trying to escape. In the bedroom, one of the officers, Mueller, noticed a large knife beneath the bed. He saw an open drawer with numerous pictures of dismembered human bodies. The officers overpowered Dahmer and placed him in handcuffs and called a second squad car for backup. Mueller opened the refrigerator and found the freshly severed head of a black male on the bottom shelf. As Dahmer lay pinned on the floor, he muttered, "For what I did, I should be dead." Milwaukee Police's Criminal Investigation Bureau conducted a search and found 4 severed heads, 7 skulls, 2 human hearts and parts of a limb. In the freezer, there was an entire torso, a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators found 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp, and, in the 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in the acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures showing the dismemberment of Dahmer's victims in detail. The chief medical examiner later stated, "It was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene." Over a period of 2 weeks, detectives conducted over 60 hours of interviews with Dahmer, where he confessed to everything he had done. He admitted to having murdered 16 young men in Wisconsin since 1987, and 1 victim, Stephen Hicks in Ohio, back in 1978. Most of Dahmer's victims had been rendered unconscious before their death, although some had died as a result of having acid or boiling water injected into their brain. Dahmer admitted to performing sexual acts with his victims' dead bodies. He confessed to eating the hearts, livers, biceps, and portions of thighs of several victims. Dahmer said, "It was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long." He had planned on building an altar, dedicated to himself. It was a place where he could feel at home. A place for meditation from where he believed he could draw a sense of power. He said regarding this arrest, "If this had happened 6 months later, that's what they would have found." On July 25, 1991, Dahmer was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Dahmer pleaded guilty to all charges. Attorneys at Dahmer's trial debated whether he suffered from either a mental or a personality disorder. The prosecution claimed that any disorders did not deprive Dahmer of the ability to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to deprive him of the ability to resist his impulses. The defense argued that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease and was driven by obsessions and impulses he was unable to control. Defense experts argued that Dahmer was insane due to his necrophilic drive, his compulsion to have sexual encounters with corpses. For the prosecution, Dr. Fred Fostel testified that Dahmer was without mental disease or defect at the time he committed the murders, saying that Dahmer was calculating and cunning, able to differentiate between right and wrong. He had the ability to control his actions, and whose lust overpowered his morals. Numerous other professionals testified for both sides. Independent of either side, court-appointed mental health professionals stated that the murders were the result of a pent-up aggression within Dahmer himself. He killed those men because he wanted to kill the source of his homosexual attraction to them. In killing them, he killed what he hated in himself. Palermo concluded that Dahmer had a severe mixed personality disorder, with antisocial, obsessive-compulsive, sadistic, fetishistic, borderline and necrophilic features, but otherwise legally sane. Friedman testified that it was a longing for companionship that caused Dahmer to kill and that Dahmer was not psychotic. He described Dahmer as amiable, pleasant to be with, courteous, with a sense of humor, conventionally handsome, and charming in manner. He was, and still is, a bright young man. He diagnosed Dahmer with a personality disorder not otherwise specified featuring borderline, obsessive-compulsive, and sadistic traits. The trial lasted 2 weeks. For closing arguments, the defense argued that Dahmer's compulsive killings had been a result of a sickness he discovered, not chose. Boyle portrayed Dahmer as a desperately lonely and profoundly sick individual so out of control he could not conform his conduct anymore. The prosecution closing statements described Dahmer as a sane man, in full control of his actions, who simply strove to avoid detection. McKinn described Dahmer as a calculating individual who killed to control his victims and retained their bodies merely to afford himself a prolonged period of sexual pleasure. McKinn argued that by pleading guilty but insane to the charges, Dahmer was seeking to escape responsibility for his crimes. On February 15th, the court ruled Dahmer to be sane and not suffering from a mental disorder at the time of each of the 15 murders. In his statement, Dahmer stressed that he had never desired freedom after his arrest, and that he honestly wished for his own death. He said that he did not kill out of hatred, that he understood that nothing he either said or did could undo the terrible harm he had caused to the families of his victims, and that he and his doctors believed his criminal behavior had been motivated by mental disorders. He understood that society would never forgive him, but he hoped God would. Dahmer closed his statement with, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done. Thank you, Your Honor, and I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration." Dahmer was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 10 years on the first 2 counts. The remaining 13 counts carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment plus 70 years. Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment in 1853. The death penalty was not an option. Dahmer was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution to serve his time. being placed in solitary confinement for his own safety during his first year. He was then transferred to a less secure unit, where he cleaned the toilet block for 2 hours a day. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer left his cell to complete his assigned duties. 2 of his fellow inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, went along with Dahmer. The 3 of them were left unsupervised in the showers of the prison gym. Around 8:10 a.m., Dahmer was found on the bathroom floor suffering from extreme head wounds. He had been severely bludgeoned in the head and face with a short metal bar. His head was also bashed against the wall many times. Dahmer managed to survive the beating and was rushed to a nearby hospital. He was pronounced dead 1 hour later. Anderson had been beaten with the same metal bar and died 2 days later. Scarver admitted to attacking Dahmer and Anderson with the metal bar as they cleaned the locker room. According to Scarver, Dahmer did not make any noise as he was being bludgeoned during the attack. Remember to tap the bell notification to be notified of new videos. Please also hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I hope to explore the mystery of life with you again. Until next time, goodbye.